Welcome to The Connecting Place with Andrea Fabry, making the connection between health and your environment. Now, here's your host, Andrea Fabry.
Well, do you know how to properly ventilate your home? Not many of us do, according to one researcher, and we have him with us today to talk about the importance of proper ventilation when it comes to our homes, offices, and schools. Professor Tim Sharpe is an architect, co-founder of the Macintosh Environmental Architecture Research Unit in Glasgow, Scotland. Recently, Professor Sharpe and a team of researchers published the results of a survey showing that most people do not properly ventilate their homes and talked about the implications of this. So this interview is going to yield some very practical, helpful information. But first, let me welcome Professor Sharpe to the program.
Good afternoon.
Well, let's start with the survey itself. What were you expecting to find? Who did you survey? And what did you find?
Okay, so this was a survey that we did on behalf of the Scottish Building Regulations. They commissioned the survey because houses have become more and more airtight in recent years for very good reasons. It's to stop them being drafty, to stop them losing heat, to make them more energy efficient. So airtightness in and of itself is a good thing. However, the question which arose is they hadn't changed their regulations for the ventilation requirement. So the question is, did they need to do that? We had been involved in several projects which had been looking at real-time performance of buildings and had seemed to find quite a lot of data which suggested that ventilation rates were very poor. So building standards had seen this, so they commissioned this piece of research which asked us to look at some new build homes built to be fairly airtight. And they wanted to know two things. They wanted to know how people interacted with their ventilation, and then they wanted to know what the consequences of that were. So we did several things. We did a survey of 400 houses, and we asked people about their ventilation habits. And then we took a subset of those houses, representative subset, and we went and actually measured the ventilation and the interaction in those houses. And that's what we came up with.
How many houses was that, was the subset?
The subset was 50 houses.
50, okay. Well, what did you discover?
So it's interesting. When we were asking people about their ventilation habits, a couple of things. So people have two choices with the houses we were looking at. These are naturally ventilated houses. They will have windows that people can open, and they will also have something called a trickle vent, which is a small slot vent. It's usually found above the window. Normally it's found above the window. It's controllable, so it can be opened or closed, which raises a question in and of itself. But that gives you background ventilation, and then windows are used for purge ventilation to move larger amounts of air.
These are homes in Scotland, correct?
These are all homes in Scotland, yes, built to sort of fairly recent building regulations.
Okay, and trickle vents are common? I don't think they're common here in America.
They are common. I mean, they are actually this is the point, that they are a requirement of the building standards here. You need to have some provision for background ventilation.
So were people using their trickle vents? Because again, it sounds to me like in the interview process, what you realized is people have no understanding of what these vents are even for.
Well, that was quite interesting. We asked the question, do you know what a trickle vent is and what it's for? And we expected a lot of people to say no, they didn't. But actually, most people knew it's for ventilation. So that was a slight surprise. However, the main thing is we asked people, are you using your trickle vents or not? And most people weren't actually using their trickle vents. About 60% of people, a bit more than that, had their trickle vents closed, and they remained closed all the time. About 30% had them open, and they stayed open all the time. There was a few people who opened them, closed them, depending probably on kind of seasonal things like wind. But generally speaking, most people weren't operating their vents. They had them either open or closed, and most people had them closed.
And how much does this impact health? I mean, even you might want to share a little bit about your background as an architect. How did you become interested in the health implications of this?
Well, that's quite a long story, I guess. Our first involvement in health goes back sort of maybe 20, 25 years or more, when we were doing work with damp houses which had damp and mold. And we were finding this quite often, and we were trying to get things changed. We were trying to get these houses improved. And basically people were getting blamed for their lifestyle, and it was nothing to do with the buildings and so on. What happened is that there were some medical studies which were done around that time which established that there are actually quite bad health implications of having damp and mouldy homes. And as soon as that health link was made, action started to happen. People got more motivated by it, and secondly, they were able, for example, to take their landlords to court and win because the houses weren't of a reasonable standard. So then that really kind of drove on changes to regulations, which at that point were really aimed at making houses more affordable, more warm, more kind of comfortable. So the reason I got interested in ventilation more recently is because we are making houses perform much better. They're much more energy efficient and so on. But when we were looking at houses, we kept seeing problems, even in modern houses. Problems sometimes of dampness and other kind of issues. And what we were observing, pretty ubiquitously, is that ventilation was not great. So this has got us interested in the topic of ventilation now in kind of modern homes.
So what is the relationship between mold and ventilation?
Okay, so in older housing, the problem tends to be that you have thermally very poor housing. So where you have warm, moist air, that tends to find very cold spots in a building. And in sort of 1960s buildings, that's fairly kind of common. Where the air cools, it condenses, and you have moisture, and the mold really likes those conditions. It grows really well in those kind of conditions. In more modern houses, you don't have that problem of cold particularly, but you do have problems of quite high vapor pressures because in both cases, you're not having enough air being moved. What you're trying to do is get rid of moisture as much as possible. Because that warm, moist air, if it finds a cold spot, if it's not being moved around, then that's when condensation can form.
What are the implications of your research? The fact that these homes are being made, they're better in terms of the opportunity for ventilation. You found people aren't utilizing this. So what are you hoping to come from your study?
Well, just going back to the study, there's a couple of other elements to it. I mean, we asked people about their window opening, and people did open windows a lot more often. But it was interesting. When we asked them why they opened their windows, it was because the house was too warm. And when we asked them what stopped them opening the windows, they said they were worried about heat loss.
Right.
So there's a strange kind of dynamic. What was interesting is that when we asked them about their air quality, they said it was fine. They said it was okay. It wasn't a problem. However, when we went and looked at that subset of houses and measured the ventilation, we found it to be very poor. So this raises certain questions. It was found to be poor across all the set, but even in those houses in which the trickle vent was open, it still wasn't good. It was slightly better, but it still wasn't good. It didn't seem to be producing enough ventilation to keep indoor air quality.
And how do you measure that? How do you know indoor? I think everyone listening would say, well, how could I know if my air quality is good?
Okay, so what we measure carbon dioxide. When people breathe, they breathe in oxygen, they breathe out CO2, and we know pretty much the rate at which people do that. So people are sort of producing carbon dioxide all the time. If the ventilation rate is low, then that starts to build up. If the ventilation rate is good, it doesn't build up so quickly or doesn't reach kind of high levels. So we can look at the CO2 levels, and if we know the shape and size of the room and what the ventilation provision is, we can estimate what the ventilation rate is of that particular room.
Okay, so you just measured the CO2 levels in the rooms.
Yes, yeah. We were focusing particularly on bedrooms. Bedrooms are interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, they're quite a good place to do this study because you've got really stable conditions. So whatever ventilation provision you set up when you go to bed at night, that stays in force overnight. Nothing changes particularly. So it means that you can use those spaces as quite good indicators of what ventilation is looking like. The other thing, of course, is that bedrooms are a place where people spend an awful lot of time, long uninterrupted periods of time. So, if conditions are bad there, then that's quite a big exposure risk. So that's what we're concerned about.
Okay, so you measure the CO2 levels. Does that, you can infer if it's very damp that there are mold problems, or do you infer that there is just a buildup of chemicals? I mean, how far, what all can you infer from a CO2 measurement?
Okay, so we're measuring CO2. We're also measuring temperature and humidity. So with temperature and humidity, you can know what the hydrothermal characteristic is. You can know if there's a lot of moisture in it. When you look at the CO2, you can look at the ventilation rate. The other thing to say about CO2 is that it keeps bad company. So it's very useful as a proxy indicator of poor ventilation. And so where your ventilation is poor, if you've got pollutants, then you get a buildup. And this is one of the issues. So we're sort of worried about moisture to some extent, but we're also worried about pollutants, particularly in kind of modern homes. There's a lot of kind of chemicals out there. There's things like volatile organic compounds, there's particulates, there's other stuff. There's quite a lot of stuff in modern buildings. So, you need good ventilation to try and get rid of that. You need source control as well. You need it to not be there in the first place. But a lot of kind of effluents, pollutions actually come from people themselves. I mean, it's kind of, it's things like hairsprays and, conditioners and even things like air fresheners, things like that.
So do you recommend people regularly monitor their CO2 levels in their house? Would that be a good indication of how healthy their home is?
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I kind of would actually. I mean, so going back to the survey, remember I said when we asked people about their air quality, they weren't particularly aware of it. So a lot of people are not aware of air quality as an issue. A couple of the things to say about the survey. When we calculated the ventilation rates of those dwellings, they were really poor. They were certainly much poorer than they needed to be for air quality, and something like 42% of the houses, they were poorer than they needed to be just to manage the moisture. So that, clearly that's a cause for concern. To answer your question, so yes, people being awareness of ventilation is quite an interesting thing, and there are bits of kit which can do this. One of the things which happened as a result of this study is the Scottish Government changed their building regulations.
Since the study?
Yeah. So now in new buildings, there's now a requirement for the bedrooms to be fitted with a carbon dioxide sensor, which will give occupants some indication of what their air quality is like. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of effect that has. I mean, it is interesting. I mean, I've got one of these things in my home, and it does change the way you behave. As soon as you become aware of it, you are suddenly aware of what your ventilation rate looks like, and that's quite important.
So it can help you decide, hey, I need to open a window here.
Yes, I mean, interestingly, in the survey, what we found is there's about 20% of the population, they always sleep with their bedroom window open, and they always have. And they've been brought up that way, and they have this idea that it's healthy to sleep. Or actually, their idea is it's unhealthy to sleep with the bedroom window closed. It's stuffy, it's uncomfortable. And you know what? They're right. In those houses where that window was open, even a little bit, the ventilation was much better. Much better.
Now, was this done in what season of the year? What were the outdoor temperatures?
This was done in the winter.
Okay, so you're talking about opening at a crack even will help.
Just it only needs to be a little bit. And it probably doesn't, if it's blowing a gale outside, clearly you can close it. But there is something about having it open just a little bit. I mean, two interesting things about that. Firstly, there's a kind of concept that's going to cause a lot of kind of heat loss. It doesn't really. Firstly, if you're in bed at night, actually having a slightly cooler bedroom is probably better for you. That's the first thing. The second thing is that your heating system is not on at night, generally speaking, so you're not losing that heat. Mm. The irony is, for other people, it's the other way around. So what happens is they have their bedroom window open at night. Sorry, I beg your pardon. They have their bedroom window closed at night. They kind of get up in the morning, they come back in the bedroom and think, oh, it's really stuffy in here. So that's when they open the window. But that's in the morning when the heating has come on. So actually that's when you're losing quite a lot of heat. So that's probably a slightly more inefficient thing to do.
Absolutely it is. And you're right about just cooler temperatures and health, but overall just fresh air. I mean, it's such basic basic knowledge that we truly have lost. And this seems to be what your work is really doing, is bringing this right to the forefront, proving it, with the survey, the research, and the documentation. What are the other implications? So one would be, well, first of all, there's already been an implication in your country. Now they require the CO2 monitors in bedrooms. That's amazing. But what else would you want to see? What else is the takeaway for the people listening in our country or around the world for their home environment?
Okay, so it is to be more aware of the need for fresh air. Fresh air is, it's a good thing. We like to go out and get fresh air. That's a positive thing, right? We are increasingly spending more time indoors, and getting good air, getting kind of clean air, keeping the air inside kind of fresh and healthy is important. There are two elements to that. One of which is being able to ventilate the home, being able to kind of get some fresh air in. The other is to just think a little bit about what is in the home, and to know a little bit more about what sort of materials and paints and stains and finishes and things like that. We're kind of starting to look at the impacts of some, there are two things. There are building materials, the stuff that the house is built from. For example, a lot of particle boards, things like that, have formaldehyde. Now, formaldehyde is a pretty horrible thing. It's known to be a carcinogen. So if you've got a lot of that in the house, it doesn't good off-gassing, so the gas comes out of the material. So trying to stop that stuff being in the house in the first place is not a bad thing to do. But it's also looking about what are the chemicals you've got in the home. As I say, that it's quite difficult territory. I mean, actually, in the States, there's probably slightly better awareness of things like materials. So that's one thing, and then making sure that the house is well aired, is well ventilated, is another. I think the third one, perhaps, going back to the moisture thing, is trying to sort of not introduce moisture when if you can avoid it. So it's things like if you're having a shower or a bath or whatever, then you can have the window open a little bit. When you come out of the shower, close the shower room door, but leave the window open, so that moisture goes out. What people do a lot of the time is that they come out of the shower and then they walk out the shower room and leave the door open, and all that moisture follows them, as do the damp towels and things like that.
Okay, so that makes sense. Unless you have mold growing in your shower, then you would need ventilation in there, right?
Well, you need ventilation in the shower anyway. What you want to do with any kind of wet space, so that's kitchens and bathrooms, is try and get rid of that moisture at source.
Okay, what about? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, you're just trying to get rid of it before it finds its way into the rest of the house.
Makes sense. Now, you've got to talk about your environmental assessment of domestic laundering. This is fascinating, and I don't think a lot of people think about this.
Okay, so this was a study we did a little bit before this, actually. It did lead to this later study. It was looking at the effects of people drying clothes indoors. Used to be that laundry was very much a sort of outdoor activity, that people would have a wash day and then it would all go out on the line, and that was all kind of fine. Increasingly, people are drying clothes indoors more and more for a whole range of reasons. Sometimes it's to do with, if you live in a flat, you haven't got an outdoor space. Sometimes it's convenience, sometimes it's space, stuff like that. So we were looking at that as a potential problem. Again, so what you've got is relatively well-sealed houses with less ventilation. And now you're taking a whole bunch of very wet clothes and you're hanging them up. What's that moisture going to do? Where's that going to go? If you think about it, you think about when you empty your washing machine, you think about picking up that laundry basket. Think how much that weighs in comparison to the dry clothes. Right. That's how much moisture there is. Imagine if you just tip that out as a bucket. That's a lot of moisture which is finding its way into your home.
What about using a dryer, though? If you take that heavy wet and put it into a dryer and it's properly vented to the outside, what about that?
So that solves one problem and it causes another. So it solves the problem of the moisture, but then it costs you a lot of money to run these things. I mean, that was the kind of other thing that we looked at. I mean, people using tumble dryers, you're using kind of mains electricity to dry clothes. It's really expensive.
Okay, but it is safer than hang drying.
Yes, but the ideal thing is to try and dry your clothes outdoors.
Well, I mean, I know it's become so foreign to us, and in the last year, I've started washing outside and now drying outside. I'm getting there slowly, and I absolutely, of course, love the way the laundry smells. I love how clean it is. There's no question it's better.
Well, let me just ask you something about, you said how the laundry smells. Are you using conditioners?
No, I don't use. I make my own soap even, and then I rinse it. Yeah,
because that's something we touched on a little bit. Is sometimes these things kind of smell nice, but they smell nice because they're made of some chemicals that we don't quite know what they are or what sort of effects they have. Another thing to mention about doing stuff outside is sunlight's a good antibacteriological agent. So it kills bugs. So getting stuff in sunlight is really kind of healthy. Getting the bedding out there, getting that kind of clean, gets rid of the dust mites, things like that.
Let me go we're almost out of time, but let me go back to the study on ventilation and the research in the 50 homes, the subset of the 400. You also found that 83% of mechanical extract systems were underperforming. Just touch on that.
Yeah, well, that's another component of it. So this idea that you extract moisture at source, what that has led to in building regulations is a requirement to have a mechanical extract fan in the kitchen and bathroom. Makes sense. Okay, so you're having a shower, you turn the fan on, that fan sucks the air out. You don't necessarily need to open the window for that to happen. And the regulations say that they need to move air at a certain kind of rate. What we found was that a lot of the fans just weren't doing it as much as they should be. They were underperforming for a whole kind of bunch of reasons. It was quite interesting when we talked to some of the manufacturers. They said, the thing is, what we do, and the only thing we can do is we test our fan in the factory and it moves air at the right rate. But we don't install it, and we don't know how it's been installed, and we don't know if there's a duct or a grill or something on the outside, or if it's been set up right. And so, it's a pretty simple technology. It's a hole in the wall and a fan, but that seems to be kind of going wrong. This is part of a larger problem in terms, certainly in the UK, in terms of the construction industry, in terms of the quality of things which are built and how well they actually work. A lot of this work has been around performance gaps. So that's differences between how buildings are supposed to work and how they actually work. And that's actually quite a big thing. All the stuff we've been talking about this afternoon has been to do with performance gaps in terms of ventilation. And we think they're important because there are health implications. There are other issues in terms of sort of energy and other things. But, there is this sort of problem about buildings maybe not being built quite as well as they should be.
Absolutely. So this is my final question for this segment anyway. How would someone know if their bathroom fan is working well?
Well, it's difficult actually. It's very difficult because how do you measure it? You probably don't. I mean, the only way that we were able to do this is because we were taking part in a research study, so we could go in with a fan and with a testing machine and actually kind of test the fans. It's actually quite hard to do that.
Well, you could do it just intuitively, I suppose. Just how fast does the moisture seem to go? I think just generally, I can tell when a bathroom vent fan isn't working well. I mean, you can just almost tell, don't you think?
Yes, I mean, you sort of can. I mean, it should be, getting rid of that moisture kind of pretty quickly. I mean, the other thing is to make sure that it also works. Often they have two modes. So they have a kind of background mode and they have a kind of boost mode. It's also to make sure that they are turned on. I mean, there is a problem that a lot of people come across, which is that if you've got, for example, an ensuite bathroom, right, there's a fan in that, and you turn the light on, the fan goes on. Yeah, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And so someone goes to the bathroom in the middle of the night, turn the light on, and the fan goes on. It makes a hell of a racket. So they switch it off. They disable it. There's an argument about whose fault that is. My contention is that's the fault of whoever made the fan too noisy. It's not a reasonable thing to not want to be woken up in the middle of the night. So, again, that's one of these kind of performance gaps issues.
Well, this is so practical and so helpful. And as one who has lived through a severe mold exposure and has this passion to educate people about indoor air quality, I can't thank you enough for your work and for today's interview. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Hope it's useful too.
You've been listening to The Connecting Place, making the connection between health and your environment. Join us again next time for The Connecting Place with Andrea Fabry.